Hello everyone, here we are with Professor Ramón Buckley, and he's going to tell us what he can show you in Madrid. So, Professor, what can you tell us about Madrid?
Madrid is very well placed. It's right in the center of Spain. It's the belly button of Spain, and it's connected to all the whole Spanish territory, and so it's one of those places that it's surrounded by beautiful small towns, medieval towns, which can be visited. So there are many things to visit, not only in Madrid but beyond Madrid.
Fantastic. So how long have you been to the city of Madrid? Have you been living here for a long time?
I've been living here because my father was English. He came to Spain during the Spanish Civil War, and he came over, and Madrid became his home during the Spanish War, where he befriended great journalists like Erns Hemingway and Vincent Sheen, and there he traveled through Spain with them, and he saw the war from the beginning to the end. And then eventually, after a few years, he came back to Madrid. Madrid now then being ruled by Franco, and he actually continued his career as a journalist in Madrid until practically his death in 1973. My first home was Madrid, although I was born in Barcelona, but my first home, the place where I can identify as living most of the year, was certainly Madrid.
So we have a Catalan living in Madrid, and he's very passionate about history and art, right? And we are in one of the most beautiful places of the city of Madrid. What can you tell us about this museum of Prado?
This is one of the most beautiful areas of Madrid. It is situated on the eastern part of town, and it's here where the French Bourbons, actually took over this part of the city. I would say that the Prado Museum is probably it. It is one of the most beautiful museums of the world, and it has a direct connection with the Spanish kings. It's a royal collection, a collection of paintings which the Spanish kings, through the centuries, the Spanish kings were sometimes good, sometimes bad, but they were always very great art collectors. So just being able to see their collection of painting over the centuries is worth it. The Prado doesn't need really anything else, but just what they had in their palaces, which was later on transferred to this building in order to become one of the greatest museums of the world.
So we were saying that the Prado Museum is right next to the Thyssen Museum, that is a bit west, and then south we have the Reina Sofia.
When I was studying art here in Madrid and then teaching, we noticed that really the collection stopped towards the year 1900, or just before 1900, particularly with the great master Goya. And Madrid did not have great modern art collections. And then suddenly, by chance, Baron von Thyssen, who comes from a German family. Actually, the Baron, the last Baron who came afterwards, was more liberal, and what he gathered was an excellent collection of what we call expressionist painting, German expressionist painting. Suddenly, after many, many years, something I had never experienced as a young man, you could actually go from the Prado to the Thyssen and continue, so to speak, the history of painting. So the history of painting continue where the Prado stops, the Thyssen continues. So this was the great contribution of the Thyssen to art in Madrid. It just opened up a whole new era, the era of the late 1800s and the early 1900s, when Impressionism became important in Europe, particularly in France. And this is what the Thyssen has, which the Prado doesn't. An excellent collection of Impressionist paintings, capturing the moment when Impressionism was being conceived for the first time in France, and then going on from Impressionism to Post-Impressionism until we come to the great masters of the 20th century, which we can find in Reina Sofia, which is just down the road from the Prado. So let's say that within half mile of the Prado Museum, the whole history of art is here. From the traditional art of Spain in the Golden Age, in the great years of the Spanish Empire, to the modern art of the Impressionists, to the latest tendencies in 20th century art, which of course are two great masters who both happen to be Spanish, Pablo Picasso and Salvador Dali.
What do you think Mr. Dali would think about today?
Mr. Dali would be fascinated because he would imagine these days, on the one hand, where the digital has come so strongly attracting us, and where painting has gone beyond the representation of the real world to the representation of dreams. Dali's great contribution to painting is that he doesn't paint what he sees, he paints what he is dreaming. Greatly inspired by Sigmund Freud, of course, who was the great, his great master, and from which he takes on, and he becomes the great painter, the painter of dreams, perhaps more specifically the subconscious, the reaching into beyond consciousness into the subconscious. And one of the things we're going to see at the Museo Reina Sofia is a self-portrait, which of course all painters do self-portraits, but a self-portrait not of himself, not of what he sees, not the way he looks, but a self-portrait of his of the insides of himself. This is the first portrait which we have at Reina Sofia of what is going on in his mind, what he is dreaming. Typically, the self-portrait is called the great masturbator. Dali was, of course, referring to himself.
Okay, so we have Dali, we have Picasso as well, the Guernica, one of the most important paintings of the 20th century, representing the horrors of war. So there is a lot to see here, but I know you have a passion for Miguel de Cervantes and Don Quixote, the man of La Mancha. Can you tell us a little bit about this tour?
I think one of the shortcomings of Madrid is that it does not have a place like, as is the case of Shakespeare, for instance, in London. If a Spaniard goes to London, he says, "Well, where was Shakespeare? Where did he can go to the Globe Theatre. He can wander the places where Shakespeare still knew, or he can go to Stratford-upon-Avon, where supposedly he was born and where his family came from. If a foreigner comes to Madrid and the first thing he will say is, "Well, where is Miguel de Cervantes?" And all we will be able to show him is a huge statue, which is next to the Royal Palace, and that's it. That's it. Because the other thing that we might find, what we've been trying to find, are his bones, but even that is not absolutely certain that they're his. So where do you meet Cervantes? See, one of the things I'm interested right now is what I would call literary tourism. Sometimes literature tells you much more than history itself. History, of course, is very important, but literature tells you much more. And that's the point about Shakespeare in London and Cervantes in Madrid. You can find out a lot about Cervantes. But in the case of Madrid, you have to leave Madrid and come to one of my tours.
Correct.
This is always making fun of his hero. He's always making fun of his hero. He's laughing at all of course, it's a very comic novel. But behind his hero, Don Quixote, there lurks the man himself. There lurks Cervantes. And we know this in many, many different ways. So many of this insanity of Cervantes, of Don Quixote, really becomes deep wisdom in the words of Cervantes. So I've always defended that it's a book with two characters. An obvious one, which is always making a fool of himself, which is Don Quixote. But behind Quixote is always his master Cervantes, Miguel de Cervantes. To examine both is the object of my tour, to be able to understand both the author and the character.
Okay, perfect. Professor, we've been talking about men all the time, but we have a tour that is very special for you. The Two Ladies Tour. Tell me about it.
Let me say first that it's a traditional tour. Segovia surely is one of the most beautiful medieval towns in Spain, and Ávila is very close to Segovia. It's also a medieval town, and of course it's well worth visiting both. But what I do is focus on not the towns themselves only, but the woman behind these two towns. And you have two of the most wonderful women in Spanish history. In Segovia you have Queen Isabella, who married Ferdinand from Aragon, and thus Spain came together. What we call Spain today did not exist until the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon, eastern part of Spain, and Isabella of Castilla, the center and the central part of Spain, and the north and south. So the two coming together of these two kingdoms are really one of the most outstanding beginnings of the Spanish personality. Now, if you see this incredible lady first and talk about her, and then go on to Ávila, where you have another one of my favorites, which of course is a nun called Teresa, Santa Teresa of Ávila. And to understand the greatness of Teresa of Ávila, you have to understand that that is the century of religious confrontation. The 16th century is the century when Luther and Calvin protest against in the Christian church. The Christian church is torn apart. There is a total fracture of the Christian world, and it's interesting that Teresa invented a third world. So you could say that she was neither. You could argue that she was not either totally Catholic or totally Protestant. She was, of course, a Catholic nun, but she insisted that there was a third world, a third way towards God, which was by going inside yourself. If you could meditate and go into your own self, if you can see what is inside you, and if you could bring that out, you would eventually become. He imagines his soul to be like a castle, and as she goes further and further into her own conscience, and she thinks that God can be found not outside of us, but inside our own selves by reaching into oneself.
So two strong women. One was a queen, the other one was a nun.
A nun who at that time, not only was she, you say, well, she was a great mystic, yes, but she was also a woman who who decided to found a new religious order, and she would tour Spain from one town to another, starting new monasteries. So what is fascinating of Teresa is that she's both a mystic and she's both a dreamer and a doer, if you want to put it that way. She's dreaming on the one hand, she's doing on the other. She is creating new convents following her own new order.
Erns Hemingway, he's a man that visited Spain in the 20s, 30s, and 60s. He's a very special character, and his father was a close friend of his, and he was a journalist during the Civil War. Tell us a little bit about him.
Yes, the connection started during the Spanish Civil War in 1936. But Hemingway, of course, was coming to Spain since the year 1923. So he according to most people think, it was Gertrude Stein, who, the great American writer in Paris, who told Hemingway that the best place in Europe to enjoy life was to come to Spain. Comes to Spain and falls in love with bullfighting. The reason probably being that he said Hemingway had taken part in World War I, and he was injured. He had a very deep wound, but he managed to survive, of course. And later on, he would say the only place where you can experience war when there is no war is in the bull ring in Spain. Somehow he saw bullfight and the bull ring as a sort of reenactment of the war itself, the fight between man and beast in the case of the bull ring. Somehow reminded him of what he had experienced in World War I and what he would experience in World War II. So bullfighting is one of the reasons why he came to Spain and why he fell in love with the country. The second reason, I think, was of course his assignment as a journalist to cover the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. And Hemingway soon found that my father was one of the few journalists who had been in Spain before, like himself, and who knew a lot about Spain and the Spanish character. So they soon became close during the war. They covered the same fronts.
And what can you find about Hemingway in Madrid? Because you have a couple of tours, one inside the city and another one that is outside near the mountain chain of Guadarrama, right? Because there is an episode of the Civil War that happened there, and you like to read some of the pages of one book that is related to the Civil War, right?
Madrid was surrounded. When Hemingway arrived in Madrid, February 1937, Madrid was surrounded by the fascist troops, and Madrid was holding out. The Republican troops in Madrid were holding out against the fascists. And so Hemingway was here, and he had almost a direct view of what was going on. Now, some people think that Hemingway came to Spain as a journalist, which in theory was true. In practice, he only came, or the big reason for his coming was to write the great novel that he expected would win him the Nobel Prize. So that's the reason why he came. Obviously, he was a journalist, but he was always looking for the great novel about the Spanish Civil War. And in one of these experiences, he found out that from the international brigades, the volunteers who had come to Spain, there was one of them who particularly attracted him. And so by talking to a commander of the international brigades by the name of Robert Merriman, he had long conversations with him about his life before Before the war, he had been to Soviet Russia, etc., and finally to Spain. And Hemingway built the character of Robert Jordan of For Whom the Bell Tolls, based upon Merriman. So this is something we're going to see, how Robert Merriman inspires Robert Jordan. My father and Hemingway covered a very short offensive from the mountains of Madrid towards the town of Segovia, although they didn't reach Segovia, but they were heading towards Segovia. This offensive was failed as an offensive, but Hemingway managed to understand what the scenario for his novel was going to be. So basically, what do? I take the group of tourists or whoever is interested to follow the footsteps of Robert Jordan from the high pass of Navacerrada all the way down to the bridge which Robert Jordan is supposed to blow, all the way up to the cave where he was supposed to have lived. Robert Jordan somehow becomes the hero of his novel, and he writes this magnificent novel, which was a huge bestseller because, of course, people were. It was written during the Second World War, but people were still fascinated about what had happened in Spain before the Second World War. So it became a huge bestseller, and it didn't win him the Nobel Prize, but it certainly is one of the novels that he put most of his own self, most of his personality, most of his emotions that he experienced.
Fantastic, Professor. If you guys want to know the rest of the story, come to Madrid and join Professor Buckley in a new tour. So, see you soon. Thank you, sir.